Welcome to this introduction to a lesson designed for learners of English who are reaching for actful advanced level reading. These slides and the lesson materials that they discuss are all licensed to you under a non-commercial, share-alike Creative Commons license. Thank you for citing my authorship properly and respecting copyright. Here I give you a link to access the source text from NPR. The text is a personal blog-style article about the phenomenon of cultural appropriation. It mixes personal narrative with related news items, quotations from relevant expert authorities, and personal reflection. The result is a mixed genre text. The text adopts a relatively colloquial style directed at a general audience. It has a lot of rephrasing, contextual clues, and exemplification. These features make it appropriate for students reaching toward advanced proficiency. There are two sets of lesson materials. The student-facing materials, or worksheets, can be distributed to the students as hard copies or as a PDF. In the student-facing materials, there are a few introductory sentences to explain to the learner the purpose of each section. There are task instructions directing the student to perform specific actions, such as circle a number. And for each task, there is post-processing, such as sharing answers, checking answers, or discussion. There's also a teacher-facing version of the lesson that helps the teacher organize the use of the lesson in a classroom or other instructed context. This way, the students are not just doing a task and moving on, but are checking their common understanding, resolving outstanding questions, and reflecting on their learning. I know this audience is familiar with the reading materials development model described in Rafferty and Bernard 2012, so I will point out just one thing, and that is that pre-reading in section 1 of the lesson involves both activating background knowledge about the world in general and also thinking about what might be in this text in particular. Both levels are useful to consider when designing pre-reading activities. The student-facing materials tell the students a little about where the text comes from. But before they visit the text, students are asked to focus on the key concept of cultural appropriation. The task prompt is, circle a number to indicate on the scale how strongly you agree that each phenomenon is a kind of unfair appropriation. The phenomena range from the very unfair, such as forcible seizure of property, to the acceptable, such as speaking another person's language. Not all items are easily rateable, and therefore in discussion, students will be challenged to develop a critical stance in which they have to explain their ratings. The gray area of just what kind of cultural appropriation or borrowing is acceptable, that is exactly what the article will be exploring. Because of the mixed genre of this text, it's not highly formulaic, and therefore it's not predictable in the same way a regular news story might be. For some texts, we might ask students to start with a blank slate and predict what topics might appear in the text. But in this case, the task is scaffolded with the full list of actual topics that appear with no distractors, and the students simply predict the order. This task forces students to think about how texts are organized logically, and this means that they are forming hypotheses about the organizational structure of this particular text. Their predictions link to the next task, where they will check the predictions. As students examine the text for the first time, they're given just 3 to 4 minutes to check their predictions. This strengthens the skill of text mapping, perceiving the overall topical organization of a text in advance of close reading. The teacher is prompted to ask students to recall some of their reasoning processes. Such reflection develops students' awareness of their own process of hypothesis confirmation and testing during reading. So they come to recognize that reading is much more than a process of decoding word by word. The source text is a sort of mashup of personal blog, news story, and editorial opinion piece. In this task, students identify these differences. They're given checkboxes to identify features of each of these 3 genres. They're also invited to mark specific locations in the text that match each box. They follow up with some kind of reflection organized by the teacher. Awareness of genre helps students see the text less in isolation and more in connection with other texts they see around them, and makes them aware of expectations they might have when reading texts in specific genres. The specific information task is student-driven. Students fill in a table where the two columns are interesting details I understand and questions I still have. The rows in the table are each of the topic headings they have just been working with. So there's a connection to the preceding task. The table has a few sample answers filled in. The teacher needs to determine how exactly to conduct post-processing. It might be limited to discussion with answer sharing and question resolution, but it could include the creation of a common document to hold individual students' contributions and constitute a sort of summary table. In this way, students' outstanding questions would not only be answered in the moment, but the response would be preserved for use in later tasks. For example, questions about specific words and phrases in the text may connect to the following lesson section, Focus on Language Forms. There are 3 task sets in the Focus on Forms section of the lesson. The first task set is closed-ended multiple choice, focusing on specific phrases in the text. The second task set is open-ended and student-driven. Students self-select and list new words or phrases and write their own definitions. A list of suggested words provides scaffolding for this task. At the advanced level, it is appropriate for students to self-select discrete vocab items they want to select and define. A follow-up quiz prompt might be, write 4 new words or phrases you took from the text and provide a simple definition for each. The third task set in the Focus on Forms section of the lesson draws students' attention to the use of verb tenses in the article and how different tenses interact with direct quotation. For example, she said to me, I want to go too. By adding the prompt, what do you notice? The task pushes students toward developing metalinguistic hypotheses. These hypotheses require testing through guided discussion. Students are now ready to put the text to use. For instrumental texts, such as travel guides, the naturally associated task would be to use the text to develop a plan of action, recommendations, or a range of choices. This text does not fit that scenario, since it is personally reflective, but also contains a certain amount of social commentary. The natural task for this text seems to be personal reflection on the questions raised in the text to establish one's own standpoint on cultural appropriation. Having students condense their interpretation of the text into an infographic is appropriate. Think of similar infographics that are often seen on college campuses. In this interpretive mode lesson, it is appropriate to step down to intermediate level for a task in presentational mode. The infographic format allows the student to convey their most important insights from the text in a simplified format. Post-processing for this task could include a real or virtual gallery walk in which students leave comments and questions for one another. Finally, students are ready for skills transfer to a related text. The task has a 4-part prompt. What is the author's main point? What do you like best in the new text? What do you disagree with in the text? And what questions do you still have? As a stepping stone to performing the task independently, the teacher can organize everyone to perform the task first using one specific suggested text, and then send students out to find their own related text and return to share. Directing students' attention to materials beyond the original text fosters connection to their future practice of reading independently using learned skills. The teacher-facing pages in the lesson documents feature some suggestions for assessment associated with the lesson. Either students can be challenged to create an infographic based on a new text, in which case the teacher can show students the suggested rubric that's provided for assessment, or they can be asked to perform a recall or recap protocol. There are also suggestions for focus on form assessment items. Best practices embodied in this lesson include significant student-driven elements. The lesson features ample post-processing, provides rich guidance for the instructor, and connects the text to real-world contexts in terms of both content and genre. Thank you for your attention.